Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Madeline and I am the creator and designer behind Madswick, which is a pattern company. I make PDF sewing patterns as well as fabrics, and today I am so excited. I am making a video tutorial for my tree skirt pattern. This was the first pattern that I ever developed and it has been such a big favorite, but a few years in, I realized that a video tutorial would definitely be helpful. Although the pattern is great on its own, I want to make sure that you guys have those visuals ready for you if you ever get stuck on any issues. So for this tutorial, you will need to purchase the pattern. I will link it below. It is called Scalloped Tree Skirt. And when you purchase it, either on my Etsy or through my website or any of my stockists, you will receive multiple files. You will receive an instruction booklet, as well as files to print or project this pattern. This pattern has AO files, A4 files, and the A4 is also US letters, so it's a print at home file. The AO will be sent to a print shop of your choice, or you could also use the projector files if you have a projector from home. Then you will also receive an instruction booklet. This is the instruction booklet. I have it here, and as you go through, you will be able to hopefully answer every question that you might have. But of course, I'm always here. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at hello@madswick.com and I will answer your questions as quickly as I can. In the instruction booklet, we have a table of contents as well as explaining the files that I have. I have a video tutorial linked in the instructions, and I will link it below about how to assemble a PDF pattern. So if this is the first time that you've ever used a pattern that just comes as a PDF, I will show you how to assemble that pattern, as well as if you are wanting to only print one of the sizes. This tree skirt comes in 4 sizes. And so you could just click on the layers in Adobe Acrobat to print just those sizes. I have Adobe Acrobat linked. It is a free software that you put onto your computer. It only works on computers, not on mobile. And then this instruction booklet goes through things like seam allowance. So this seam allowance on this pattern is 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. The difficulty level of this, I would say, is an adventurous beginner, but you could definitely use that as your first project. The hardest parts are just quilting or sewing some of the patchwork together, but it is very doable, and this video tutorial should very much help you. This pattern has 4 sizes. The first size, which is what we will be sewing today, is the mini tree skirt. It is 20 inches or about 50 centimeters. Then there's a 42 inch or 107 centimeter, a 48 inch or a 122 centimeter, and then a 60 inch, which is the equivalent of 154 centimeters. So 4 sizes to pick from that come in your pattern. On the pattern pages printout, it will tell you which pages to print for what size on the first page of your print at home file. For the other files, you will just need to, for the AO, it'll just print all of them. For the fabric and yardage charts, I've included 4 different charts. Well, it may look like 8. So that just means I'm accounting for if you're in yards or in meters. So just make sure you are really paying attention right there. Are you looking at yards? Are you looking at meters? Whatever you're used to. And then there's a few pages that go into the fabric and yardage. So what I've done is I've made sure that for each size, I have included how many fabrics you are planning on using. So for today, for my tree skirt, I know that the back I want to be 1 solid color, which is what the pattern accounts for. And then on the front, I've chosen 2 different fabrics, this one and this one, for my different scalloped quilted patchwork. Now you could also do 4 fabrics on the front. You could pick 4 different fabrics. You could pick 8 different fabrics. You could even include 16. I haven't put fabric yardage for that because I plan on most of you using each fabric at least twice. So make sure that you're just looking at those to get the accurate measurements for what you need for fabric, depending on the size of tree skirt that you're looking for, and then depending on the amount of fabrics that you want to do. I have done 2 and I've done, I believe, 8. I'll show you those pictures, and I love both of them for different reasons. So it's just whatever look you're going for. So just be sure to look at those. It can feel a little overwhelming, but just focus. Am I doing yards? Am I doing meters? And then focus on what size am I doing? And then focus on how many fabrics you're using, okay? So there are only 4 pattern pieces in this whole pattern. There's the big back side. You'll cut that in your fabric that you like the most, I guess. And you'll also cut that out again in batting. And then you will also have pattern piece number 2, which is this that you will cut 16 of. And then you will be cutting out your drawstrings, and you'll be cutting out, that's pattern piece number 3. You cut out 4 of those. And then the bias binding, which is another long strip of fabric that's cut on a 45-degree angle. That is pattern piece number 4. So make sure you've printed it out. I've given a cutting layout for you with some optional ways that you could cut it out on your fabrics. And once you've done all of that, meet me in your sewing space and we're gonna go ahead and start sewing. So make sure that you cut everything out. I do highly suggest you use batting. I skipped it on this sample because I was like, oh, it's heavy enough, and I regret it, to be completely honest with you. I think that the batting just adds a nice cush to it. I also think it holds its structure better. So if you can get your hands on batting, highly recommend it. The first sample that I did, I couldn't get my hands on batting and just I like cotton batting, by the way. I go with the thin type, but you could go with a thick, whatever you like. But my first time I couldn't. I used a thick shower curtain that we were no longer using. It worked great. I actually really love the weight of it, but batting is by far my favorite. So the pattern gives you instructions for all of those things, but I just wanted to point that out, that the batting is optional. I just don't think it will look as good. So that's that information, and I'm so excited to show you guys this whole video tutorial on how to make this pattern. It is such a fun one. All right, now we're gonna make the ties. You will have 4 ties already cut out, and you're gonna be folding in with wrong sides together. You're gonna be trying to enclose these seams by following these measurements that I've already written down for you guys. And basically, we're just trying to make sure that there aren't any raw edges, and we're kind of making this tie a little bit smaller. Once you've done all 4, then you'll take it to the sewing machine. On the next step, you're going to be basting those ties to your back. So the back, I've already added my batting to it. You don't have to do that. You could do it at the very end, but I just pinned it together because it was easier when I was cutting it out. And then my notches were a little hard to find. So just make sure you've marked your notches, and you're gonna put your ties onto your notches. And what we're doing here is we're basting them in place so that they're just ready to go after our next steps. When you baste, I recommend increasing your stitch length to 4 or 5 millimeters. Because I had the batting, I decided I was just gonna go ahead and sew them on. It's totally up to you. Sometimes basting a tie is a little tricky, but I just sewed them, and I actually backstitched within the seam allowance. Now we're gonna go ahead and start doing our panels. Now I'm doing 2 different fabrics, so I'll just be rotating with my dark fabric and then my light fabric, and I have them right sides together. But if you're using more fabrics, maybe lay them out and kind of decide how you're going to do that and how you're going to design your tree skirt. But once you've done that, you sew them together. Make sure you've got the exact seam allowance, that 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, because if you get off, it can cause problems down the road. It's not the end of the world. You just may have to do some unpicking, but if this seam allowance does get off a little bit, it can make it so that it doesn't fit the backing properly. So just be aware of that. Make sure that you're being really conscious of that. This isn't, there's just not a lot of wiggle room. Once again, I'm just rotating back and forth between the dark fabric and the light fabric. I'm making sure I back stitch, and every time I do one, I'm just adding a new panel in. If you are dealing with the 60-inch or one of the larger tree skirts, you may need to pin these. I chose not to, just because they were small enough that I didn't feel it was necessary. But if you're really looking for accuracy, and if you're really looking for just taking your time, make sure to pin. Of course, just whatever is your personal preference. So, like I said, I go all the way around. There are 16 panels. Make sure that you've got all 16 sewn together and all 16 cut out. And once you've done that, it will fit perfectly, hopefully, around on the back. Now, I managed to forget to film this, and so I apologize, but you need to press those seams open. And then, once again, this somehow did not record, but what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking the back. You can see that there, it's my solid fabric. My miniature one already had the batting attached, and then you lay the panels on top, and you're basically just laying these on top and matching up all of the outer edges of the scallops. I pin out all of like that point area. I pin that first, and then I pin the rounded section. And if you haven't attached your batting yet, you're gonna go ahead and pin the backing with the panels, and then you're going to add the batting on top of either side. It really doesn't matter as long as your back and your panels are facing right sides together. It doesn't matter which side you put your batting on, because you're going to be flipping all of this right side out. So this is a time where you're making sure everything is lining up. If there's any discrepancies, you'll probably notice them here. You can trim some things down, or you can unpick and adjust where necessary. Everything should line up really nicely though. If you followed the seam allowance and you've cut your panels out to the correct size, it does just require a little bit more accuracy. You just need to make sure that you've done the best that you can, and it's still going to work out and look really, really beautiful. All right, and then you're going to go ahead and go down the edges. So basically all of the straight and scalloped edges, you're going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, or 3/8 of an inch. You're going to go all the way around. The only thing that you are not sewing the raw edges of is just that internal circle. That's where we'll flip everything right side out and put our bias binding to secure everything and have the tie. When you are going around the curves, I highly recommend that you go slow, that you pivot as much as necessary. If on this one, I did notice that because it's so small, some of my curves were a little wonky, and when I flipped it right side out, it just wasn't as curved as I wanted it to be. And so take your time. Don't be afraid to take your time here, and just really make sure that those curves are really curvy and less pointy. This is easier on the bigger sizes to get those curves really curvy. So just make sure, especially if you're doing the 20-inch tree skirt, that you're going slow. All right, you'll see that we went all the way around all those edges, and we are now just trimming down all of our seam allowances. Now, when you trim all these down, I would recommend that you use pinking shears. I normally do, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I got a little bit too close on a couple of these, and when I washed them, and when I washed this tree skirt, some of the stuff did fray. So don't do what I did. I'm laughing at myself for having made such a simple mistake after all these years of sewing, but don't get too close to the seam allowance. It's not worth it. All right, I'm flipping everything right side out and pulling out those ties. I made sure that I pinned those away from everything so that I didn't sew over them, but you can kind of see I'm kind of getting pointy scallops at the moment. But once I ironed it, it kind of fixed quite a few things. See, they're pretty pointy, but just take your time here on ironing, and I rub my fingers together and I really pull everything out, and you can see a huge difference right there. Now they're a lot more rounded, less pointed. And if you're going for the pointed look, then that's great too. But if you're going for the rounded look, then make sure you iron and take your time. Now we're gonna edge stitch around all of these seams. You start up at the top, and then you go down, pivot, and go around all of these corners. Once again, take your time here. The seam allowance at the top stitching is 1/2 of an inch, or 1.2 centimeters. And just take your time, have fun with this. You could do a decorative stitch. You could do something really fun here. All right, now we're doing the bias binding. This will be done along that center circle of the tree skirt. I folded in the short edges, and now I'm folding in just one of the long edges. This one will be folded over. The other one we're going to attach right here to that center circle. Fold the bias binding in half and find that notch, that middle panel, and you're going to start right there. Pin all the way around that circle, and then you're going to take it over to the sewing machine and sew with your regular 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. You may have to pull the bias binding just a little bit. This is a pretty intense curve, but because you're using bias binding, it's going to work out really, really beautifully. Once again, I'm sewing those things. I'm kind of straightening out the curve for a minute just while I'm sewing, just so I have a little bit more accuracy. And then once you've done that, you can trim down the seam allowance. This is optional. If you're not using batting, you may not need to do that, but with using batting, I would recommend it. And then you're gonna flip to the wrong side, and you're gonna start flipping that bias binding over the raw edge. So now all the raw edges should be enclosed. You won't be seeing any more, and you're gonna see how nice this bias binding is curving around that circle in the middle. It looks so good. So once you've done that, once you've gotten around that circle, you'll notice that the bias binding is still hanging there, and you're gonna need to fold those together so that none of the raw edges are enclosed. And so I'm basically just folding that bias binding in half, and I'm pinning that in place. Once I do that, I take it over to the sewing machine, and I start at the very end. Be a little bit careful. I would start about 1/2 inch in, just so that your binding doesn't get stuck in your feed dogs. But back stitch, start sewing all the way, and then you're stitching in the ditch. You don't have to stitch in the ditch. You could sew a little bit in, but basically what you're doing is you're placing your needle as close to the edge of the bias binding as you can, that already sewn edge, and you are just stitching that bias binding in place. You could hand stitch it if you really prefer, but it's nice to stitch in the ditch because then you can just seamlessly follow into the line right there of your ties and sew those in place. Once you have finished doing this, you just need to press, and if you want, you can wash for a softer look, but there is your tree skirt, hopefully ready for years to come.